That's awesome. We'll get there eventually. This is what it's like in person too. I'm disorganized as a human being, so you can feel very welcome. Glad you guys could join us. Whenever you're joining us, we are here this week. We are seeing snow melt outside. We just lit the candle for a day of Advent for peace. And we are finishing up Matthew today. This is my last opportunity to chat with you guys this year. I will be back in January if all goes to plan. And so I just wanted to, last time I was here, I asked if you guys could go through Matthew 27 and 28. You could listen through it, read through it, however you find yourself engaging with Scripture. I had hoped that you would take time to do that because I'm not going to read through it all today. It would be literally double the amount of reading, and I think for a lot of us, this is kind of the end or the beginning of the story, depending on which way you look at it. And so Jesus' life comes to an end, and resurrection is all going to happen during this time. And so I'm really grateful that we actually kind of engage with this all at once. There's not the drama of, the imposed drama. Everyone knows how the story ends. That's probably why we're here. That's why this church is here today. That's the history of the community of faith that's called Christianity, is that a resurrection happened after the crucifixion. In fact, one of the things I found really interesting going through this, I was speaking with a pastor friend, and I don't know if you remember hearing the scripture teaching around the time of the Queen's passing. Do you remember kind of the little mini sermon there? I was absolutely blown away with the amount of times that the resurrection of Christ and the idea of hope was part of that conversation. I was not expecting it. And it said that she had been heavily involved in the process of her funeral and everything. And so I found it very interesting that there was so much emphasis on this idea of new life, this idea of resurrection. And I think we can get caught up in so many things within our idea of what's important in life. And in Christianity, one of the things that kind of sets the idea of Christianity apart from different systems of faith is this idea that it centers around resurrection and new life. Not that none of the world religions talk about resurrection or life after death, but it is kind of this keystone moment for those who follow the teachings of Jesus, that it was meant to validate everything he had said. This is what his followers found very important to focus on, even later on when the Apostle Paul was writing letters to churches throughout the Roman Empire. Spent time focusing on the fact that because the resurrection happened, then these things are true of you as followers of Christ and stuff. So I don't think we could spend too much time talking on it. If you remember the last time we spoke, Judas had betrayed Jesus. Jesus had been taken away by a mob. And you see Peter just like denying him and the rooster crowing and, that whole dark scene, and it kind of ended with that. And the next day, it says, early in the morning, all the chief priests and elders of the people made their plans on how to have Jesus executed. That's how the next chapter 27, starts out. It goes from Jesus being taken and kind of brought into this kangaroo court in like one of the high priests' like household areas, like want to hit like his property, his villa, whatever, however you want to put that phrase. There was a courtyard and it was his space. And so Jesus was brought in there, and so they said they wanted to get the group of of Jewish men there that were allowed to be there riled up enough to get him accused of a crime in their system. And then the next morning, because they got him to say that he was God and that was going to be blasphemy, so they said, Jesus, you see blasphemies, and here he is. He's doing it right now in front of us, so he's obviously bad. So then the next morning, they're like, okay, we have to figure out how to get him executed, because they did not have the power as a Jewish people to actually inflict death on him. And so that was only allowed for the Roman Empire, for the overarching Roman Empire. They had to have full control of that. And so they had to now find a system in which they could try to convince the ruling government over them, this oppressive government that they despised, but they wanted to find a way within that Roman system to get Jesus executed. And so that's what chapter 27 starts out talking about. That's the context. That's the background of it. But what's interesting is, you see in verse 3 of chapter 27, Judas saw that he was convicted, saw what was happening, and Judas has this incredible reaction, this not incredible in a good way, this terrible, sinking, like disastrous thought process of seeing that the person that he had walked beside, the person he'd called brother, the person that he'd ate with and faced down the world, faced down people who had wanted him dead for years. They'd stood side by side, and he had betrayed him for a bit of cash, and he just breaks. And it says, he said, I have sinned, in verse 4, I have sinned, for I betrayed innocent blood. He knew what he had done. And he said, and he said that to the leaders that had paid him. He's like, I did wrong. Like, this shouldn't be. He's trying, like, he had a clarity that happened to him. And so he just threw the money down at their feet, essentially. Left, went out, committed suicide, talks about it. And the chief priests picked up the money, and they, like, kind of just put it aside. And they used the money. This is such a thing. They didn't want the money to pollute the temple. They knew what they had done was so wrong. It says this, the chief priest picked up the coins and said, quote, it is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. So even they, the ones who had worked so hard, and you see this whole thing starting out, it's like, okay, now how do we get him convicted under Roman law? This is their attitude. But he throws the money back at them, and they don't even want to touch it. And so like, okay, let's do a social thing, and over here, let's buy some land to bury foreigners, because they couldn't be buried with the rest of the Jewish people. Like, there's a very clear caste and difference in the system. And so they just wanted to get that money gone and removed. Even they themselves didn't want to have anything to do with this. This is how wrong what they had done was, and they knew it. And so verse 9 is interesting, because it's kind of like one of the last times you see a quote from the Old Testament. But it says, then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used it to buy the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. It was again referring to the Jewish scriptures themselves, talking about this time where the Messiah would come and be betrayed. And these were texts that, like, for the Jewish people, it was so hard for them to understand, because they're waiting for a Messiah, but then there's these scriptures that were constantly telling them that, like, once he would come, they would betray him. And they're like, why would we ever betray him? Like, this is always a thing. And this is written years later. Like, this book, what we're reading here and we call Matthew, it wasn't written while they were walking with Jesus. This wasn't written in the process of walking with him. This is written years later. And when they look back, they say, wow, this happened, and it's just like our Jewish scriptures taught us. Matthew is a Jewish man, and he said, this is just like the scriptures taught us, what Jeremiah talked about all those years before Jesus, when he said that this was going to happen. And so I think it's very, very key that it brings this whole process into light, that it was they were able to realize God's plan and how that system had come apart. So then you see in verse 11, they bring him before a guy named Pilate. And this is the Jewish leaders trying to bring Jesus under the condemnation of the Roman law so that he would be actually executed. They could not do it. their hands were tied, but they just desperately wanted him dead. So they're going to work with their oppressors to try to convict a guy that they know they wrongly accuse. They won't even touch the money. And so they go to Pilate, and he spends time talking to Jesus. I find this very interesting, and many people have. And he's like, what are they doing? Like, and he asks even the Jewish leaders, like, what are you doing? Like, none of this makes sense. He says in a very, like, he's looking at it objectively. He doesn't have the religious belief of the Jewish leaders. He hasn't sat and watched Jesus teach. He hasn't watched Jesus turn water into wine, loaves and fishes spread out to an entire multitude. He hasn't watched any of that. So he just stands back as a person that has perspective on the situation. And he spends a fair bit of time, like verses 11 through 26 talk about this process of him saying, this doesn't make sense. And then Jesus sits there silently through the whole thing as they're accusing him and pointing fingers at him and saying all these terrible things. He sits quietly. And Pilate's even like, why don't you, I don't understand, why don't you even defend yourself? The most simple person would be trying to defend themselves in this process. And it gets to the point where the crowd gets so riled up, and he says, this is what he says. Verse 11, meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him this one thing, and this is what set it all apart. This is very early on. Are you the king of the Jews? And the only thing Jesus replied was, you have said so. He's asking him if he has authority over the Jewish nation. This representative of the Roman government who says that the only authority is us as Rome, and the only people that could be put in charge of the Jews is us. We're the only ones that can say that. And so Jesus says, well, you're the one. It's your words, not mine, is in the modern vernacular. And he looks at it, and he incites the Jewish people to the point the Jewish leaders, not the nation, but the leaders of the Jewish nation get so infuriated that they're like, we have no king but Caesar. Like, they look and they say, we don't care who God's appointed. We don't care who God's promised. We don't care what this man has done to show that he's God's chosen one. In fact, we'd rather just have Caesar. He's our king. The oppressor king, the one who conquered them, that they despise, that they talk constantly evil. They won't let them in their houses. They won't eat with them. If a Roman person touches something, it's considered unclean by them. They're not allowed to enter their temple. And they're like, no, that guy's our king. Caesar's our king. Jesus isn't, like, we don't want anything to do with this guy. And that's the point of what happened. So he's committed to this process, and the soldiers, you hear the soldiers mocking at Jesus, verses 27 through 31. And then eventually you see the crucifixion. And in Matthew, you see Cyrene, like Simon of Cyrene is one of the conversations in here, and you see a guy carrying the cross for Jesus. I think we all kind of have images of this process where Jesus arrives and is hung on a cross and is left there to die. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, everything goes dark. People are shocked once again to see the hand of God, like, affecting nature and affecting everything. God having full control over everything. They have no explanation for this. They don't understand what's going on. And then Jesus ends up in verse 46, coming to the place where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he says it in the mother tongue, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. And essentially God turns away. The idea is that God turns away at that point and says, you're carrying the sins of the world. I can't even look at what this is. And Jesus feels that moment where he's responsible for the sin of the world. That's the process they're talking about here. And yet, he's surrounded by mockers. People are mocking him as they walk by on the way. They put out the crosses at the entries to town or along the main road coming into town so people could see the executions are going on. Keep people under control. The threat of death is a very powerful thing, especially in an invasion army. And so Jesus is being mocked as people walk by. And they're saying things like, let's see if Elijah comes save him, He said he's going to tear down he said he's going to tear down the temple and build it. Like, he can't even get himself off a cross. All these things that they're saying of him. This process of him coming to that point of death, and then he passes. the one, I think the thing that's interesting to see and understand is that the one that had control to raise others back to life, to heal others, to do all these things, to shake the very core of nature, to calm the seas, think back through all the things that Jesus did, heal the lepers, the impossible task he took on, and he dies, he passes at that moment. There's a time where he leaves this earth, his soul leaves. And then it goes through the process of the burial. And a guy came and gave up his family burial spot. Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, was like, this isn't right. You know, like this man was special. So he asked permission of Pilate even to be able to do this. They go bury him. They wrap him up. And they put him in the tomb. And that's his resting place. I mean, we talk about this and we think about this at Easter time. Maybe, you know, we spend more time emphasizing this. But just the lack of hope, the fear that was coming on all those, because now they've been identified with Jesus and they've seen that they can even kill their leader. All those who have followed Jesus or started to follow his teachings, the amount of fear, like they weren't lighting candles of peace. There was an immense amount of fear and dread at what had occurred for their own lives and for the lives of their family. I don't know how much you've thought about that. Like people like, holy cow, he's dead. Like he's actually gone. Like how do we didn't, like he was going to be king. Like, you know, all the things that they thought of him. And they had followed him. Some had, you know, figuratively sold the farm to follow him. Like some had literally left every part of their life behind to follow him and be one of those identified with him. And then the leader himself, the one who had done no wrong, the one who had only healed and helped people, the best of the lot, was taken down, killed for everyone to see in broad daylight. And think about that process. They're sitting there looking and saying, if he can't make it past the judges, how in the world are we going to survive this? You understand what I'm saying? The thoughts of their family and everyone. This is a dark time. And not just because they're like, holy cow, we thought he was the leader of the nation and now he's gone. But this legitimate fear of life. They're like, I saw the tomb. Like I saw his body being put in there. And like, who are we? So that process goes on. And I love this. I'm going to read this next section. So it kind of fans away from that. And then I love this part. For me this time, this was a really encouraging thing. I like this. Verses 62 to 66, if you want to hang with me. Chapter 27. So right before Matthew 28. And here's what it says. The next day, the one after preparation day, they're talking about the feast coming up. The chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. They said, "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go make the tomb as secure as you know how." He's like, well, whatever, go do your thing. Like he's done with it. He's already washed his hands before. He's like, okay, whatever you got to do, like just like essentially it's just kind of this like, just leave me alone. Like go take your guard, do whatever. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard. I love that the guys who had hunted him down and found ways to kill him were some of the first people that you get to see in this story that are terrified of his resurrection. They were listening as he told these stories, as he referred to this. Even some of the disciples, they're done. They're like, it's over. You see them when Jesus comes back. You guys know he comes back. I'm not saying it's not a spoiler. But when Jesus comes back, you see them like, holy cow, like it can't be you. But the ones who put him on the cross, the ones who did all that work to do it, they're the ones that are terrified of this process. What will it mean? Even if they think, I don't believe that they thought he was going to raise from the dead. But they're like, what would happen to all of his followers if they even thought he was raised from the dead? They're terrified of a movement of people who are choosing to do good and choosing others above themselves. This idea of this internal this internal transformation, this gospel of internal change that Jesus had taught, they're so scared of people that are living that way, taking away their power, that they're like, we don't even want anyone to steal him from the tomb, because what would happen if they thought he really did raise himself from the dead? They're not sitting there believing it. Like, I think that we have to be clear. They're just saying, like, there was rumors, and this is what's going to happen. We're pretty sure someone's going to try to come take him, so the followers. But they were terrified of this movement of people that thought that an internal transformation where I care more about the person opposite of me than my own self was going to revolutionize the world. That they went back again to this Roman leader and were like, we need your help again. They were admitting their lack of power over this transformational lifestyle that Jesus had taught and shown throughout the entire nation. So it says here, you go to Matthew 28, and it starts out with the spoiler that I already gave. Jesus has risen. After Sabbath at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the other Mary, went to look at the tomb. There's a violent earthquake. Angel of the Lord came down from heaven, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone, and sat on it. And they go in to look for Jesus, and he's gone. And they're like, what happened to him? You guys know the story. It's not a secret to you. And the guards are like, I don't know what to say. And so they go to the leaders, and they're like, we know, like, you really didn't want it, but we don't know what to say. And so they pay off the guards to say that some of the people came and took him away, some of his followers. And Jesus then spends the rest of his time back visiting with those he'd walked with most closely and talking to them. The ladies were the first to kind of see. They run back. And he tells them, have everyone go to Galilee. I love that he didn't go back to Jerusalem, the ruling throne. He didn't go back in there. He could have gone back in and shocked everyone. I love this part of the story where Jesus goes back to his home area, where kind of the majority of what he did kind of happened in this region. Majority of the people who followed him. It's kind of a small podunk region. It's a place that's forgotten by people. It wasn't the power center. It was far from the power center of the world. Not even close to the power center of Israel. And he says, go there. So the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. But some doubted. I love that. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded with you. I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always, even to the end of the age. He takes time, and the last thing you see Matthew writing in this story is Jesus holding out his hand and saying, have peace. I'm still present with you. What I've taught you is not gone. What I've taught you doesn't disappear, doesn't stop working in a couple decades. This transformational living, this internal transformation that I've tried to teach you and show you what really matters, it's going to go with you. It's going to do things. And they have that, and it's to the end of the age, and he's just saying, for always. And then he goes away. And I think it was really cool, the idea of have peace, and it is peace this week. And I was thinking of how do I, as I was approaching these two, I was like where in Scripture of these two chapters does it really talk about peace? There's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of angst, fear, and trepidation, and Jesus is marked down in this phrase saying, I am with you always to the very end of the age. And I think that's where the peace comes in these passages. And it's how this book ends, the book of Matthew. And so that's my thoughts on the last two chapters of Matthew this week. And really, you guys will be reading from Luke, because there's a really cool, Luke's writings cover a lot more of the very early life of Jesus, talking about the shepherds, the actual birth. The guy was a doctor. It's marked that Luke was a doctor, and so he's very much more interested in some of these things. And You guys will talk about it. But knowing kind of how the story ends, it goes from this place of fear, like with Mary and Joseph and everyone, and moves to a place of peace. The whole story ends with "I'm with you always." And I think that, I don't know, I think that for me that gives me something. This story ends with the idea that this lasts forever. These teachings that I've given you, he's saying they're there for always. And we still have them today. Think about the idea of these words existing in like 1,000+ languages, like unfathomable. People barely had access to written content if they were the highest class of citizen in any kingdom at that time. And yet, it's available around the world. It's on my phone. I can listen to it in my ears when I drive my car in multiples of languages. And it's a pretty special thing that we follow these teachings. Anyway, that's what I have for you guys for this week. If you were here, those of you joining us online, there's Grinch goodies here from an event last night, so we're going to wrap up a bit early. But I hope you guys have an incredible Christmas season. I hope they have an incredible year end, and that you guys find peace in this time. I think like there's a lot of stuff between families and tensions of community that we face, and there's something about the year end coming. You kind of feel like it's the end of the parentheses, and we're going to hit a restart. But yeah, I just hope that there's an overwhelming amount of peace in everyone's life this December. So yeah, that's it. I'll pray and we'll wrap up, and then we got some local stuff we'll do. Hey God, thank you for today, and thank you for the access to this teaching around the world and in so many ways. We're humbled, and as people gather around the world talking about peace, about the coming of Jesus this time of year, pretty humbled to be part of such a large group of people throughout history. And we appreciate that. In your name, amen.